Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar on leading practices in Treasury. This is Brian from Strategic Treasurer, and we're pleased you could join us as we discuss practical, focused recommendations and considerations for Treasury's daily tasks. Our speakers for today are Mark Brousseau, Strategic Director at CMLI, and Craig Jeffery, Founder and Managing Partner of Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Mark and Craig, and I'll now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Welcome, everyone. Good day, good evening, good morning, good night, whichever area you're from. We're so glad you've joined us. Mark, it's good to present with you again.
Likewise, Craig, always a pleasure.
And we do presentations in person, digitally. It's all good fun.
Never a dull moment, Craig.
All right. And speaking of never a dull moment, when we go through the agenda, that's like the highlight of a webinar, and we'll go through that. What are we going to talk about today? So first, we'll begin with bank relationships. So where's the value of relationships in this idea of leading practices? How do we maintain leading practices in our relationships with banks or with banks and corporations? So we'll look at the advice they give, credit that's provided, services, and how do you magnify or amplify those benefits? That'll be the first part that we touch on. For bank account architecture, this is the structure to support good cash management, good treasury management, and good risk management. And there's part of the design that's necessary there to make that work. As we move over to the cash forecasting piece, we say increasing accuracy and speed. We're going to be discussing, to some limited extent, the short-term and long-term priorities for cash forecasts. There'll be a little contrast between what FP&A does and what maybe Treasury does for the cash forecast. Now, on the compliance side, we ended up pulling a slide out on this topic just due to all the content we were packing in here. Compliance is one of the sections that we have in the detailed ebook, and we would invite you to download the full ebook. Read up on that section. If we do another one to cover some of the other areas of leading practices, we may slip that one in there, but we wanted to leave that on the slide for you to just, continue to think about where are leading practices Treasury. And then the topic of managing unknown risks. This can be for risk for geopolitical reasons, war, supply chain impacts. Can also be risk that fit in the payment space as you're making payments and the threats there from a security standpoint as criminals try to get their hands on your funds. If they can't get their hands on your funds, they try to get their hands on your information and convert that to value. For the key takeaways, we will summarize, Mark and I, relationship, structures, visibility, and preparing for disruption. And we wanted to begin the next part of our discussion with the first poll question. So right out of the gate, we got poll question number 1 and 2, double stacked for better view. Yeah, it's like the Oreo cookie, right? Double stacked. 2 questions in one. Because we like data, Mark, So
absolutely.
So the top one is, where are you in your Treasury optimization maturity cycle or level? Are you in the top 5%? Are you in the next 20%? Are you in the average middle? And this is self-reflection, right? If everybody's Lake Wobegon in the top 5%, we'll know we're a little bit too high on ourselves. But try to put where you see your organization, and we can just see what the distribution is here on our webinar. And then the second question is with regard to process. What is your status? Are you trying, when we say progress, not process, progress of how are you improving on the Treasury optimization maturity model? Are you actively working to improve against a generally improving audience? Are you seeking to maintain your current position? Or are you not making many changes and therefore you're deteriorating or you're unsure? So go ahead and respond, and we'll give everybody a moment to do that.
Greg, when you're talking to Treasury leaders these days, are they telling you that they're more focused on achieving best-in-class performance from their department? Is this something that more treasurers are striving for?
I would say some strive for best in class, like that really high world-class level of 5%. And those are certain companies in particular industries that view that as really well worthwhile. Many are focusing on being that leader area. If you see the question, they're focused there on staying in front, because what might be a leader 1 year, 2 years later, you're average, and then you become below average because things progress. So most people are shooting for, the top of average or leader, and it's a more select few that are looking at world class.
And your organization, as well as the Cash Management Leadership Institute, do great jobs of providing benchmarks for organizations to measure themselves against. One of the frustrations I have with so many finance departments is they're doing a poor job of tracking KPIs and metrics. Many of them simply don't benchmark themselves regularly, and I think that's really a disservice to themselves. Well, here we have our results to our poll question, Craig.
Yeah.
We asked.
Yeah, it's good. So any comments on the first part? What do you think about the distribution?
You know what? I think this is a pretty fair grading audience. I would assume that if you're into analytics, bell curves and all that, right? You'd assume most folks would fall somewhere in the middle. And that is indeed what that first poll question is showing us. Interestingly, 16% are unsure. I certainly encourage you to avail yourselves of some of the resources available through Strategic Treasurer and CMLI. But it's the second poll question I think is really interesting, and that is 73% of our attendees today, Craig, say they're actively working to improve their position, and that to me is really telling of what's happening in enterprises big and small that I'm talking to. Right, there's tremendous pressure to do more with less and to find ways to achieve greater agility and competitive advantage. I can't remember a time when organizations were focused on trying to wring out inefficiencies. How do you feel about that?
I think that's I would agree with that. I think we're seeing the same thing. This and I find it very encouraging, as you did, that 3/4 are actively working to improve their position. I think that's fantastic. And the other, back to one of your earlier comments, benchmarking, like what are you benchmarking against? And one of those thoughts, you and I've had these conversations, do you benchmark with what others are doing? That's one point, right? You can say, here's a snapshot of what others are doing. And how is that changing over time? Because it shows where your peers are going. And then there's the other more reflective posture to it. What should we be doing and where should we be doing things? Just because a large group may be lagging does not mean we should lag, and there's comfort in the herd. We can talk about all those, the animal videos from Africa, but the idea of, not standing out may be a problem there, but the idea of where should you be, there's two parts to that, right? Where are others and what's really essential.
Yeah, and I think the key here, Craig, is that while I'm not sure that either you or I would dictate what the answers would be for the right KPIs and metrics to track, Treasury professionals ought to be tracking those KPIs and metrics that are most important to them. So in other words, we don't necessarily care which KPIs and metrics are. You just got to continually measure yourself to be able to, identify gaps in your process, to be able to track your progress, to be able to build a business case for automation or for process improvement, to be able to see how you compare against your peers. Whatever those metrics and KPIs are for your organization, you just want to make sure you have a mechanism for tracking them and regularly reporting on them and then adjusting accordingly.
Thanks for that. And thanks everybody for taking the first poll question. So in the chat box, you'll see follow CMLI on LinkedIn. Please do that. And follow Strategic Treasurer. Please click on those and follow along. Both of our organizations post information there. It's very useful. If you do that, and then if you have a chance, put either CMLI or put leading in the chat box. So either way will work, just for and we'll share all the results from that. So Mark, Why don't you talk about Treasury's evolving role?
Yeah, it's interesting, Craig, that we're starting with perhaps the biggest shift we're seeing in Treasury right now, and that is the redefining of Treasury's place within an organization. You and I have been around for a long time, Craig, and we can remember that Treasury has typically been seen as a transactional function, right? Managing cash, executing payments, ensuring liquidity. But what's interesting is that's no longer enough for many organizations. In today's environment, what we're seeing is Treasury is being asked to really step up and to act as a strategic business partner. And to me, this is a reflection of the changing role of the CFO in organizations. So what do we do about this? How does this factor into our conversation today about becoming best in class? Well, when we think about the evolving role of Treasury, what it really means to me, Craig, is that it's time for Treasury to adopt a new mindset. And that to me is a process mindset. We need to think beyond our department silos, and we need to, understand how Treasury intersects with AP, AR, procurement, sales, and yes, even compliance, the slide we took out of this presentation. And the shift also probably requires a renewed focus for many of us on efficiency and collaboration. And, when you think about it, Treasury is really well positioned to lead here, right? We can set the tone for cross-functional alignment, whether that's, creating a working capital council that includes some key stakeholders, or even aligning those KPIs across teams. And then I think the third thing here is that we need to think in terms of how process and technology go hand in hand, right? So when we're evaluating automated solutions, whether they're powered by AI or otherwise, what we want to really do is aim for straight through processing, right? We don't want to automate the process. We want to optimize it. And so we want to strive for an environment where data is flowing seamlessly from one step to the next. So I think when I think about that changing role of Treasury, Craig, I really think Treasury has a great opportunity here. And for some of our folks on the line, maybe even a mandate to become a catalyst for enterprise-wide impact and not just transactional impact. And one way that we are trying to take those steps toward process improvement, of course, is in the way that we manage our bank relationships. Now, I know, most Treasury teams probably aren't getting as much value from their banking relationships as they could. And that's not necessarily because the banks aren't offering it. In many cases, it's because the relationships are transactional, right? They're focused solely on execution and not on a strategic partnership. So if we all agree that the role of Treasury is changing, then we probably need to agree that the way we go about managing our banking relationships needs to change as well, right? So if we want to unlock the full value of our banking relationships, we need to shift our approach. We need to move from being reactive to being proactive, from transactional to strategic. So, doing things like tracking your share of wallet, knowing exactly what you give to each bank, engaging with your bank in regular dialogue, right? Maybe implementing a scorecard to be able to see how each of your banks are performing across service and pricing and responsiveness. And maybe even leveraging the advisory services that banks are offering. I think that, if we do it right, we move this all from being a transactional relationship where contacts ad hoc, services are basic, and pricing's fixed, to, getting a lot more engagement, a lot more tailored services, probably being able to negotiate based on volume and get our banking relationships to work harder for us. What do you think, Craig?
I like that. I think you use the term transactional versus strategic. I think those are good descriptions. The other is, are you a vendor for inside your organization? Or are you a partner to inside your organization? That's also true on the relationship with the bank side. Are you partnering? Banks are providing credit, services, advice. They have, leveraging their balance sheet is a great way for your organization to be able to grow and expand. They talk with a number of companies, and while we would love them to always talk to consultants, they certainly should be talking to their banks too. They talk with many customers. They focus on industry verticals, and it matters greatly. And so the relationship, the overall comprehensive view of the relationship shouldn't be, do they just provide me advice? They just provide me with credit? Do they just provide me with services? And is it a one-on-one me and that person, or is it institutional to institutional relationship? And those things matter a lot, like you were saying.
Yeah, and banks are a great resource for industry benchmarks and best practices. Many of the banks today, even mid-market banks, are specializing in vertical markets, and I think there's some great ways to leverage that expertise that they could bring to the table, as you said, Craig.
Thanks. So we'll shift over to continue talking through this in some detail. So how do we leverage leading practices and maximize the benefits of those relationships? A few things, right? Some of these are more detailed, some of these are less detailed, but tracking share of wallet. Just a couple of thoughts on that. Everybody, what is the share of wallet? How is your revenue and value divided up among your banking partners? There's mouths to feed, if you will, right? They're going to provide credit, they're providing services. How do you share that? Tracking the share of wallet matters because you want to be rigorous and formal in looking at the relationship. Why? Why is that necessary? Because those relationships are important over time. If you're unimportant to important relationships to you, you may not get the right relationships with your bankers. If you feed one to the exclusion of others, you may be limited in what you can do. And finally, it's what banks do with your organization. They look at their relationship and see how it's performing. They look at it, they may use terms like risk-adjusted return on capital, but they're looking at relationships for value over time. And that makes sense. And so tracking share of wallet is a great way to do that. The second one is probably you've heard it. If you've been around 30-something years, there was a scorecard, balanced scorecard, but some way of rating and looking at those things, not just financially, but how are your banks providing you with advice, providing you with services, providing some type of scorecard that's more formal than the last issue you had with your bank and you're mad at them. But implementing a scorecard matters and makes sense. Engage in regular dialogue. This idea of good conversation, good communication matters. And I think we should look at it as from your institution to their institution, from your company to the bank. It's not one-on-one, but it's making sure that there's an institutional aspect to the dialogue that continues beyond any one or two people, especially the larger organization, the more that will matter. Advisory services, Mark even mentioned some of that, this idea of diversifying intelligently, spreading the wealth. As you get larger, you need more providers. You have to keep them concentrated, and maintaining that balance is sometimes more challenging than we'd like it, especially if you need more credit than your fee income supports, for example. And so how do you manage that? How do you bring the right types of players in? Maybe some players that are good at providing credit don't really want the operational activity, might be a good mix with other banks that provide that. So the transaction versus strategic approach, Mark mentioned those terms. We have a matrix at the bottom. How do we manage contacts? Transactional, it's I call, hey, we got credit coming up, we need a line or a letter coming up. It's very ad hoc, more reactive, versus we have regular and systematic and proactive reviews. If you move down further, what do you get from an insight to the bank? It's minimal, or it's advisory. They provide market insight. You ask them questions and they provide responses, not just in the emergency and spur of the moment, but systematically. We could continue talking about the continuity. I talked about that from a relationship standpoint, that there's multiple participants from your organization to multiple participants with the bank. That is so important because your managing relationships is not just about you. It certainly is about you, but it's not just about you. It's about your organization having access to the credit, the services, the advice over time. And so those are some of the core fiduciary responsibilities, some of the core stewardship responsibilities you have in Treasury.
Craig, when I think about it, the way to look at this is, your bank relationship should be working as hard for you as you are for them. And in many cases, that's not what's happening in organizations.
Yeah, excellent. And so that'll bring us over to bank account management. And Mark, would you start us off on this one?
Yeah, I know. Bank account management doesn't always grab the spotlight, but when it comes to all the things that treasurers do, this is probably one of our most critical responsibilities. And I would argue that it's probably never been more important to get it right, right? First, let's talk about visibility, right? You can't manage what you can't see. So if you don't have real-time visibility into every account, well, you're flying blind, making it hard to optimize liquidity, harder to manage cash flow, and harder to protect against fraud. Then there's security. And we know that this is a top of mind issue for treasurers these days. Any webinar on security is packed these days. It's at an all-time high. And Treasury is at the front lines of protecting the organization's financial assets. So we need to be proactive and leverage bank tools like Positive Pay. If you're cutting checks, please, for goodness sake, be using Positive Pay. Debit blocks, filters, electronic pre-authorization to stop fraud before it starts. Banks have a plethora of tools available to help mitigate your risks. And if you don't already have these in place, well, this is probably a good time to implement them. And then, of course, there's operations, right? We have to ensure that bank account management keeps pace with the needs of our business. And so that means we've got to have processes in place for opening and closing accounts and managing those account structures and even regularly reviewing bank services, so we can make sure that they're aligned with what we need from a security and operational standpoint. Look, bank account management isn't just a compliance task. It's a strategic function. And as part of achieving best-in-class results, we believe that it's one that directly impacts an organization's visibility, control, and ability to mitigate fraud. So as Treasury leaders, well, we've got to take ownership of this function. We've got to ensure that it's treated with the importance that it deserves. Greg?
I think that's great. You mentioned a couple different services. I see some chats and Q&As coming in about, hey, there's more services. And that's good. And so this is for all you banks out there, I'm going to say this on your behalf, and this is what we certainly believe. Your banks offer a lot of security services. They are not getting rich on those things. Those things protect you, and you should use those. It's in most cases it's commercially reasonable. It's a standard of good corporate conduct to use those services. Life is terrible when you get defrauded and you're like, bank, aren't you going to make me whole? And I didn't use the services. I didn't lock my door. I didn't turn on my alarm. I just hoped for the best. And so listen to your banks on those things. Those are perfect services to add.
Absolutely.
All right. So enhancing bank account management. I think this one we're going to split a little bit. You'll start us off and I'll continue, right?
Yeah, and I think the message I'd want to make here when it comes to managing bank accounts is that we shouldn't view this as a one and done activity. This is a process that should be evolving as our business or our organization evolves, right? We've got to treat bank account management as a strategic discipline, not just an operational necessity. And so there's a couple things that I think Craig and I wanted to highlight. The first, of course, is inventory. You can't control what you don't know exists. So we've got to make sure we have a consolidated view of our bank accounts, conduct the full inventory from time to time to understand exactly what you have. Next is automation. You want to make sure you can eliminate manual processes wherever possible. There's no doubt manual processes are slow, they're error prone, they leave gaps in our visibility. So if we can automate the data aggregation and reporting, and ideally do it in real time, then we're going to get a live view of all of our cash positions across all of our banks. Imagine what you could do with that kind of insight. And this is critical not just for liquidity planning, but also for responding to volatility or managing FX exposure or enhancing fraud controls. The kinds of things that are at the front page of the paper every day these days. Then there's also rationalization, and Craig's going to talk more about this, but we know that most organizations accumulate bank accounts over time. That might be through an acquisition, through expansion, maybe even through some legacy processes. But this is one of those cases where more isn't better. So you want to make sure that you can, reduce complexity and cost wherever possible. And then finally, again, bears repeating. You want to make sure you leverage your bank's services, right? Don't just set it and forget it. Banks are constantly evolving their offerings, whether that's, real-time alerts or advanced fraud detection. I'm almost reluctant to mention some of these services because I know I'm going to leave some out. But what you want to do is you want to know what services are available from your bank and evaluate how they compare to what it is you're using, and then make those changes as your needs evolves. It's not just about adding tools, it's about having the right tools at the right place at the right time. So I think, Craig, my view of this is that when it comes to effective bank account management, it doesn't happen by accident. It requires an intentional ongoing effort. And I trust you would agree with that.
I certainly would. This idea of rationalizing your accounts, bringing them, rationalization almost always means reducing, right? It doesn't always mean reducing. But if we think about the concept of bank accounts, every single bank account is a point of expense, it's a point of control, it's a point of exposure, and it's how you manage your cash management flows, your cash concentration services. So making sure that that's adapting to your organization as it grows through different phases, and then as you acquire and change dynamically. So what are the right services? How do you put those into place? Those are all vital. So when we think of things as a point of cost, a point of exposure, that matters and matters significantly for efficiency, for how we protect ourselves, and the design is crucial there as well. So bank account management is oftentimes underserved, undermanaged, and this bears looking at every couple of years. If you're changing moderately, if you're changing dramatically every year, you probably need to look at your structure to see where changes can be put in place. All right, so that brings us, you guys ready? Second set of poll questions. So what's the biggest barrier your Treasury team faces when implementing leading practices? Lack of internal resources, all the way down to resistance to change, or other, or unsure. Go ahead and pick up your biggest barrier. We made this select one, and then you can go ahead and submit that. Got a few more instructions.
I'll be interested, Craig, to see how insufficient executive support rates as a response to this poll question. What I'm hearing anecdotally is that CFOs are embracing the push toward optimization in Treasury. I'm interested to see, though, if folks on the line are still running into a roadblock with the boss.
Yeah, so a couple comments in the chat box. So there's cyber liability insurance. Good point, Lou. I think that makes sense. And one of the things about cyber insurance is they ask more questions about how you're protecting yourself. So they have a exposure if you get compromised, and they're seeing more clearly those elements that contribute to compromise, and ask, what are your practices about this? So we see that. We'd like to see 225 people type CMLI poll or leading the chat box. and I don't know where the count is now, or Brian has to keep track of those. I know we were
They're
north of
flying by
100.
now.
Yeah, now people are making things up, typing everything in there. It's awesome.
I
That's
was going
good
to
to
say,
see.
we have the folks who put CMLI poll, do they get double gold stars? I mean, that's
They
that's
get
that's
they
two
get
for one.
double the warm feeling in their heart that they would have otherwise.
Oh my
It's just
gosh. We asked you what's the biggest barrier your Treasury team faces when implementing leading practices. 37% of you identified a lack of internal resources. 20% of you identified outdated systems or technology. I imagine some of that might be with an ERP. We could talk about that in a second, Craig. 15% said resistance to change. Yeah, upskilling our teams is going to be a big storyline over the next several years, particularly as AI makes greater inroads. 8% of you identified insufficient executive support. That's good. That's not as high as it was in the past. So that's good. 7% of you said limited access to benchmark data or best practices. 14% of you said something else was a barrier to leading practices. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. I want you to use the chat tool and tell us what it is that barrier is when it comes to implementing leading best practices. Don't give the name of your boss, please, but anything else is fair game to let us know what your barrier is. So 37% of our attendees, Craig, said lack of internal resources is their biggest barrier to implementing leading practices. Is that surprise you?
Well, I guess it made me, as I was looking at the answers, Mark, it made me think we should have had a select all that apply, because this is the highest one. If you select all that apply, there's no calibration. So this one clearly sets out lack of internal resources. So I don't want to get fixated on the 37%, but that's number one by a long shot. Number two is
Yeah.
outdated systems or tech. And then resistance to change is number three. I guess that order feels fine. I'm glad that executive support is fairly
I
minor
agree. I
on the
agree.
list. So yeah, so I guess
You
that's what
know,
we've always seen. In Treasury, it's almost always thinly staffed groups. And while over time there is a general trend for Treasury groups to get larger, they're small and they're not adding a lot of people. And so this has long been the challenge. And so it's, can you get by with a lot less? There you go. Yeah, that's my answer, Mark.
well said, Craig. I would say for those of you who look, we're all overworked in finance, and we know IT resources are tight, but I do believe that some of the emerging solutions in the market go in far easier than legacy systems, and with less disruption and better integration with existing systems. Um, of course, AI, machine learning, robotic process automation have helped streamline that. But it's interesting that internal resources is still a challenge. I think it's getting, in my mind, it's easier these days. And of course, the cloud. I'm remiss if I don't mention the cloud.
Yeah, thanks for the comments in the chat box as well. So,
This is great. Yeah.
all right, red tape. Awesome.
Oh my
Great. So now
gosh.
we're going to spend a little bit of time on bank account architecture. So let's talk through it. So we have a few slides we're going to cover on this, and we'll begin with the first part is, using some sort of concentration structure always makes sense when you get to a certain size. That size may be 50 million in sales, 100 million in sales, or a certain amount of activity on the collection and the disbursement side. The smallest companies start out with a single account. It's a operational account. Everything flows into it. Everything flows out of it. And then over time, you have to add something to handle disbursements or something set aside specifically for collection accounts. And then at some point you eventually get to a dedicated concentration account as opposed to something that's handling disbursements, and or collections. So this idea of breaking these out as you get larger, there's no one size fits all, right? The $20 million company is very different from the $20 billion multinational in terms of what their banking structure looks out. So typically for the majority of those who are on the call, you're going to have collection accounts and disbursement accounts. And in the center of the screen, however you have it, you'll have a concentration account. This is the central hub for funds movement. It keeps the activity isolated. It's only summarizing collection activity, disbursement activity, and that concentration account may fund your investments, pull money from your borrowings or paying back from your lines of credit. But this is how organizations will typically progress to. So where you are in the growth of complexity will matter what your structure looks like. But this is where many organizations get to from a concentration perspective. Now, I'll flip over to a couple pictures, right? There's different ways of showing it. If your European bank shows you the activity, they'll oftentimes have a header account. Hopefully you can see that. That's the concentration account, which you might refer to more commonly in the US. But this header account, rolls all the activity up to it. So your collection and your disbursement activity, they stick it at the top of a page, but that's the same type of function. It's a header account. The summation of all your activity at that bank rolls up to that level. And we have the concentration account. So concentration account, the right side, same type of structure. It's just a way of visualizing it. More like an hourglass. So we've got all the collection activity of the receipts flowing into the concentration account, and then the disbursement accounts funded either through a ZBA structure, physical movements, or some other method of sending that out. And so the only activity that's hitting the concentration account here will tend to be just collection, disbursement, and then investment and operational flows within the rest of your organization, like let's say your line of credit or to other entities in the organization. So that's typically how it moves. There's lots of variations, but that's the core picture. All right. So bank account architecture 2. So pooling structures. And Mark, I'll invite you to jump in here as well. So what are pooling structures? Well, a concentration account is a method of pooling funds within a single organization. There's a couple other structures that you're probably familiar with or should be familiar with. This would include physical pooling. This is where the money moves. Oftentimes it's called ZBA structure, a zero balance account where the money moves between the accounts. I mean, it's digital movements usually, but we like to call it physical pooling because that's, we think about real accounts. They're all digital, but it's moving money between the accounts. So a ZBA structure is common. Notional pooling is interesting. It could be single currency notional pool or multi-currency notional pool, where the money's not being transferred by wire transfers or ZBA activity, but it's being looked at and in aggregate by the bank or by the provider. And it's being pooled notionally. And so someone says, okay, what's your total in euros, the equivalent of euros? Can you use that money anywhere across the globe? And so where are you? How big are you? What makes sense to use a physical or notional pool? What's being offered? Where is the financial value to that? So typically, to get to a multi-currency notional pool, you have to have a certain size, certain complexity, a certain number of currencies that you're using to make those pay off. But understand the physical pooling options, the notional pooling options. The last one here is short-term investment pools. So there's different arrangement, but insurers in particular, they have rules in the US governed by the different states. So there's statutory requirements by state. They can oftentimes pool their short-term money together, and there's ways that they can use that to optimize their return because they might have a lot of companies with a significant amount of short-term cash that's not in their longer-term portfolios that might be, targeting, life insurance or some other areas. So there's different pools that can be brought about. And I see some good questions about, hey, can you use notional pooling? Can you use physical pooling? What are the rules? And if you read from some of the banks, it's very interesting. Some say you can't do it, and others offer it and do use that. So it's very helpful to look at those. And Mark, I'll just mention one thing before I think I covered most of it. I may have stolen everything on this, but there's a lot of activity with virtual accounts where you have this ability to sub-segment activity without having a full-blown bank account. Now, some people call them a real bank account, but since they're all digital, are they really real? I mean, they're all real. They're all digital, but they wouldn't be set up in the same way. So any other thoughts about the purpose of this or
Yeah, I think, Craig, I would argue that visibility is the real value from pooling, right? It's not just better interest, it's the real-time visibility that you get into your cash positions across the organization. And that is a great segue into our next slide.
perfect?
Oh, I'm sorry, our poll question. This time
And
we
it,
want to know, which of
yeah,
the following areas are you currently looking to improve or reevaluate within your treasury operations? Which of the following areas you're currently looking to improve or reevaluate within your treasury operations, and check all that apply. What are you hearing from treasurers these days, Craig? What seems to be top of their list these days, and how has that changed, if at all, from several years ago?
yeah, and I want to answer it right away, but I also want to give people time and a moment to respond. So
You don't want
um,
to put your thumb on the deli
on the
meat
scale,
scale?
I do, but yeah. So I'll give it a moment, and I'll say it, and then we'll look at what they are. But uh, yeah, I think we have enough poll responses on the side. Thank you. I should have said 250 or 300 or whatever. I'm glad to see people like the data. This is excellent. So thank you for responding. So yeah, which are you currently looking to improve or evaluate? This is the group. If we say this is leading practices, and the significant portion of people said we're in the middle section, the happy middle.
Mhm.
We want to get better. Where are your peers looking to get better? So go ahead and answer it, hit submit. And Brian, when he's not counting all the poll results, we will look and see what they are. Yeah.
Poor Brian.
This is good. I think he uses, Chat GPT to total them up, or he just makes it up because we got 119.
Ah,
All right. So Mark, number one, cash forecast. Number one is tech and automation adoption, beating out cash forecasting accuracy. I'll tell you, that's a surprise. Cash forecasting is almost always one. Accuracy, I guess maybe that's why maybe
maybe
it
that
dipped
was
below.
maybe that modifier was what swung things. By the way, kissing cousins, because I don't think you can improve cash forecasting accuracy without technology and automation adoption. So interesting. And then 36% of our attendees identified risk identification and mitigation, and 34% identified bank account structure and rationalization. Um, it is no question, Craig, that finance departments are driving toward automation in general and AI in particular. And one of the biggest applications of that technology is cash forecasting. So now to the next slide. And we wanted to take a moment to talk about how cash forecasting factors into a best-in-class treasury operation. And the fact is that cash forecasting is one of Treasury's most powerful tools, but I would also say it's also one of the most misunderstood and underutilized tools in Treasury operations. Just like bank account management, which I spoke about a little while back, forecasting shouldn't be just a routine task. It's got to be a strategic function. It's got to drive decisions, not just documenting outcomes. It's the difference between being a scorekeeper and the coach, right? A strategist. So, how do we do that? How do we get more out of cash forecasting? Well, to take forecasting to the next level, we've got to find ways to think in terms of the types and scopes of forecasts that we can generate, whether it's short term or medium term or long term forecasts, all of which need to support different business needs. And to do that, we've got to find ways to aggregate data from multiple systems, ideally in as close to real time as possible. So the question is all right, so how do we do all that, Mark? And that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide. So one of the things you want to do is you want to recognize that if your forecasts aren't accurate, they're not only just they're not useful, they're risky. So if it takes too long or it's too much manual effort or you're getting stuck in a cycle of inefficiency, you've got to find ways to improve your cash forecasting. And technology is making that easier for us. And it's doing it in a couple of ways, right? And the first is, of course, artificial intelligence, right? Modern AI powered forecasting tools have really changed the game. They can pull data from across your ERP, from your banking portals, your operational systems, and they can do it all in real time. I saw that poll question from earlier about systems being a barrier. Well, AI can overcome that in many instances. And by doing this, by aggregating the data, you're going to get a more accurate forecast. They're going to be created faster, and they're going to require a whole lot less manual work. We're not going to have people who have MBAs wrangling spreadsheets all day long. The second thing you want to do to improve your cash forecast is to use your historical data effectively. We sit on a treasure trove of information in our Treasury departments. And while history doesn't always repeat itself, it can be a pretty darn good guide if you use it wisely. So what you want to do is you want to build models that reflect your historical cash flow patterns. Don't just copy and paste them, but find tools that can allow you to interpret those trends and then make predictive models. And of course, using AI and other tools, you can factor in expected variability, right? Whether that's seasonality or macroeconomic shifts or even payment behaviors. The third step to improving your cash forecast is to improve communication. Even the best tools and data can't predict what you don't know. And that, of course, is why communication is key. So you've got to find ways to stay tightly aligned with your other departments that influence your cash flow, whether that's AP or AR or procurement or FP&A or sales or whomever. You want to have those regular touch points in your process so that you can understand when any major one-off events might be on the horizon, whether that's a large vendor payment or a capital expenditure or even a new contract win. These are some of the things, Craig, that I think can improve cash forecasting and help us eliminate those blind spots. Any advice you would share?
Yeah, I think the importance of cash forecasting ebbs and flows a bit, but it never gets below like number 2 or 3 on the list of what people are doing. And so this idea of continually improving by using tech makes all the sense in the world. And the use of tools, why do things like AI, how can they help us with forecasting, especially if they're embedded in systems? Well, it can put together more models. It can run additional comparisons for us if we guide it, right? It can uh, allow us to test our cases and our models more effectively, and that's useful. And it doesn't, of course, fix someone not reporting information to you about an acquisition or a huge CapEx expenditure that didn't show up in the system, but it can also, yeah, those things require people and communication that may not be system oriented. So it becomes more and more scientific, and cash forecasting has gotten better over time as we've progressed from probably the most sophisticated was regression analysis, which required a lot of good data, to now we can, use artificial intelligence. We can use models that are based on individual cash flows of companies that was never really possible from a scale perspective before. So we see that on the receivable side. We see that in different areas being put into place that's available through bank services or through fintech providers. So a lot of promise there.
Well, there's one thing that we have learned over the past several years, Craig. It's that the biggest risks to our financial strategy often come when we least expect them, whether it's a geopolitical event, a macroeconomic shock, or even a pandemic. And that's why being prepared for the unknown is no longer optional. It is essential. So what we want to do as treasurers, if we want to be best in classes, we've got to find some ways to prepare for what we don't know. And that might be something like implementing systems to be able to monitor risk factors, not just internally, but also externally. So things like regulations or geopolitical landscapes or even macroeconomic trends. We want to leverage our data to learn from history so that we can understand what we should do for contingency planning. To weather the unexpected, we also need operational margin, the flexibility to respond without scrambling. We want to have real-time visibility into cash positions. We want the ability to understand what is happening at this moment in time. Static reports won't cut it here. Real-time data from all our banks and our entities and our cash pools. Well, that's the foundation we need when things become turbulent. And finally, we want to make sure we establish strong measures of communication, right? When the unexpected happens, our relationships in Treasury matter. So Treasury has to maintain strong lines of communication with both our leadership and our banking partners so that we can respond when decision makers come calling and say, what should we do here? And our banks, well, they can be a great source of liquidity, of guidance, and of course, of stability. But the key there, as we discussed earlier, is you've got to be in regular proactive contact. So, Craig, we can't predict what that next crisis will be, but we can be ready for it.
Yeah, the idea, and that sounds like magic, right? How can you prepare for the unexpected? Well, maybe the specifics of the unexpected you can't. It's kind of like your house. It's like, oh, I've got to spend 10 grand on this year. Last year was 15 grand on that. The year before was 8 grand on something else. There's going to be some disruption, or there's going to be something that is unforeseen in terms of the specifics, but we know those things may happen. They may come a little closer together. So, you and I spoke as we were prepping. I gave the example from Boy Scouts, right? The be prepared is the motto. Be prepared for what? For whatever. And they have something called the 10 essentials. You go in the back country or you go on a hike. What are the 10 essentials? Well, you need, water or ability to get water. You need first aid kit, some form of direction setting, something that can keep the rain off you, something that you can start a fire with. Why do you need those things? Well, you don't know what you need, but that will keep you safe, buy you time so that you can survive, in the outdoors or live longer if something is occurring. And the same thing is true here when we look at risk and disruptions. We don't know what's going to go on with, trade, with wars, with tariffs, with geopolitical issues, with pandemics. We don't know what those things are going to be or do. We just know some of those things are going to happen. I would say right now we're kind of in a middle level of disruption. We were in a low level. COVID was a very high level. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009 was a very high level. Those things change and they fluctuate. And so we have to be ready for not everything's going to be smooth. Not everything's going to be as choppy as it could possibly be. But what are those 10 essentials? I can see all my accounts. I have a good relationship with my bank. I have a good, clean forecast, running multiple models that I can adjust when those things come up. Maybe we thought just-in-time inventory was great. Now maybe just in case or just prior to certain tariffs going in place, we acquire more so that we have some kind of comfort margin. I think that's a key aspect of what we need to look at for sure, Mark. And that brings us to our final thoughts. We're coming in. There's a lot of great questions. They're talking about models, how can we use AI for cash forecasting and other things. We're doing another survey on AI that'll include generative AI and agentive AI or using agents. And I know I'd like to give a more detailed response to some of the questions that came into us on that, but I just want to say that's coming. Please take those surveys. But let's get to final thoughts. I'll do the first two pillars here. Mark, if you can finish us out. So first one is optimized relationships. We spoke about that 50-something minutes ago. This idea of our relationships with our bankers and our relationship with bankers with corporations matters on a comprehensive manner, looking at things in totality. It's service, it's fees, it's information, it's insight. How can you be important to the banks that need to be important to you? And think about that in terms of everything from benchmarking to ensuring there's multiple touch points on the relationship. And track your important relationships, at least from a wallet share perspective. There's tools that we can help you with, or talk through the process of how are you divvying up your wallet? Where is the bank making money? And if you can figure that out, that's very helpful for your discussions with your bankers. You don't want to overpay them. You don't want to underpay them. You want to maintain your importance with your important relationships. So be systematic about that. It's not impossible. It takes some work, and then maintaining it becomes much easier. Second, on the banking structure and bank account management, both Mark and I spoke about some of those, and we did it in conjunction with there's a business process where cash flows through an organization that's a result of business processes that have their start or terminus, one of the terminus points, in a banking structure. So structure matters for the process, and structure matters for your efficiency of cash management, control, and risk management. So take a look at your design, make sure it's modern and that it's relevant for where you are. And if you're not sure, where you are and what the next step might be, and when you might need to transition to it, ask for some help on that. Those are great ways to do that. So relationship structure, and Mark, you talked about visibility. We got that beautiful eye in the box there to talk about.
Yeah, and to become best in class, we believe Treasury departments have to improve visibility. Real-time visibility is no longer a nice to have, it's a must-have. Modern Treasury systems that are powered by APIs and automation and intelligent data integration, they're going to give you a live view of all your cash positions across all your banks, your entities, your currencies, your accounts. And what that's going to do is empower you with faster, more accurate insights and give your business the agility to act on opportunities or react to disruptions with the confidence that you know what's going on. And finally, disruption is no longer a rare event. It is the new normal. Just grab a newspaper if you question that. You've got to build margin into your workflows. Most of us are operating at full capacity, which means there's no room to pivot when something unexpected happens. So build margin. Second, use history and threat assessments to prepare. The best crisis response, as Craig was saying, starts long before the crisis ever hits. And finally, automate and reduce inefficiencies. When manual processes bog your team down, agility disappears. And importantly, inefficiencies also hinder your ability to focus on strategic initiatives. And that's where we began today's webinar. We believe Treasury has an opportunity to become a more strategic asset to the organization. To do that, you're going to have to get rid of those manual processes and inefficiencies.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. And we'll turn it back over to Brian.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The CTP credits, today's webinar slides, and a recording of today's webinar will be sent to you within 5 business days. And be sure to download the Leading Practices in Treasury ebook by clicking the link in the chat box. Thank you, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.